Looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., mascara streaked down my cheeks. I whispered the words that would change everything. My husband David said he was flying to Portland for another software conference, but I just watched him check in to the Meridian Casino in Las Vegas with a woman who definitely wasn't his business partner. The photo on my phone showed them laughing, his arm around her waist, room key cards in both their hands. 6 months of supposed business trips. 6 months of me cooking dinner alone. 6 months of believing his lies about quarterly reports and client presentations. But here's what he didn't know. I wasn't just some naive wife anymore. I had hired a private investigator, gathered evidence, and discovered that David's web of deception went far deeper than weekend getaways. By morning, his perfect double life would crumble, and the man who thought he was so clever would learn that underestimating your wife is the most expensive mistake a cheating husband can make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, I was folding David's dress shirts in our Scottsdale bedroom when I found the receipt. It fluttered out of his jacket pocket like a butterfly with broken wings, landing face up on our cream-colored carpet. Meridian Hotel and Casino, Las Vegas, Nevada. Date stamp showed last Thursday, the same Thursday he'd supposedly been presenting to clients in Portland. My hands trembled as I read the details. 2 nights, suite upgrade, room service charges for meals I'd never eaten, spa services I'd never enjoyed. The total made my stomach clench. We'd been married 8 years, together for 12. And I thought I knew every line on his face, every tone in his voice when he lied about forgetting to pick up milk, or whether he'd fed our cat Jasper. This felt different. This felt calculated. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, the receipt still clutched between my fingers, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. David worked for TechFlow Solutions, a mid-sized software consulting firm in the Desert Ridge Corporate Center. His job required occasional travel, mostly to Portland and Seattle, sometimes Denver. We watched Netflix on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, his fingers absently playing with my hair the way they had since we first started dating in college. He seemed relaxed, affectionate, unchanged. No guilty glances, no suspicious phone calls, no unusual defensiveness when I asked casual questions about his trip. Either he was an incredibly gifted liar or I was losing my mind over a simple booking error. Monday morning, I decided to do something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. I called TechFlow Solutions and asked to speak with David Martinez in the consulting division. The receptionist put me on hold, and I spent those 30 seconds convincing myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd hang up the moment David's voice came through the line, that we'd laugh about my paranoia over dinner that night. But when the receptionist returned, her words hit me like ice water. I'm sorry, but David Martinez is currently traveling for business and won't be back in the office until Wednesday. He's attending a client conference in Portland through Tuesday evening. My mouth went dry. It was Monday. David had left for another Portland trip Sunday night, kissed me goodbye at the door, promised to call when he landed. According to his company, he wouldn't return until Wednesday. According to the receipt in his jacket, he'd been in Las Vegas just 3 weeks ago during a previous Portland trip. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. David wasn't just lying about one conference. He was systematically lying about his whereabouts, using his legitimate business travel as cover for something else entirely. But what? And with whom? I spent that Monday in a strange fugue state, going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced through possibilities. I designed a logo for a new restaurant in Tempe, answered emails from potential clients, took Jasper to the vet for his annual shots. But underneath every mundane task, I was calculating. How many trips had David taken in the past 2 years? Where had he really been going? How long had this been happening? Had there been signs I'd missed, red flags I'd ignored, because I trusted him completely? That evening, I called my best friend Rebecca Chen. We'd known each other since high school, survived each other's terrible college boyfriends, been each other's maid of honor, and shared every significant moment of our adult lives. If anyone would know how to handle this situation, it would be Rebecca. She owned a small marketing firm downtown and had a pragmatic approach to problem solving that I desperately needed. When I told her about the receipt and the phone call to David's office, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," she said carefully, "this doesn't sound like a simple mistake." Rebecca had always been direct, sometimes brutally so, but she'd also never steered me wrong. "You need to be smart about this. Don't confront him yet. Don't let him know you suspect anything. If David is lying about his trips, you need evidence before you say a word. Otherwise, he'll just get better at hiding whatever he's doing." Her words made sense, but they also terrified me. Part of me wanted to believe there was still an innocent explanation, that I was overreacting to a series of coincidences. But the larger part, the part that had been quietly cataloging small inconsistencies for months, knew Rebecca was right. David's phone habits had changed. He used to leave it charging on the kitchen counter overnight, but now it stayed on his nightstand, always face down. He'd started taking longer showers, being more particular about his appearance before trips. Last month, I'd noticed he'd bought new cologne, something expensive and sophisticated that replaced the familiar scent I'd been buying him for birthdays and Christmas. Rebecca offered to help me figure out what was really happening. She knew people who knew people, she said. Professional people who specialized in uncovering the truth when spouses couldn't or wouldn't. The idea of hiring a private investigator felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, characters in movies or true crime podcasts. But as we talked through my options, it became clear that professional help might be my only path to real answers. I couldn't follow David myself without risking discovery, and I couldn't continue living with the growing certainty that my marriage was built on lies. The next morning, I found myself sitting in a small office in downtown Phoenix, across from Elena Rodriguez, a former police detective who'd started her own investigation agency 5 years earlier. Elena was probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She'd heard stories like mine countless times, she assured me, and while every situation was unique, the patterns were often depressingly similar. Spouses who traveled for work had perfect cover for extramarital activities. Business trips provided built-in alibis, separate credit cards for expense accounts made financial deception easier, and the emotional distance created by frequent travel often masked the warning signs that might otherwise be obvious. Elena explained how these investigations typically worked. She would document David's actual whereabouts during his next business trip, using surveillance, public records, and other investigative tools to create a timeline of his activities. If he was indeed going to Portland for legitimate business purposes, we'd know within 24 hours, and I could apologize for doubting him. But if he was lying about his destination or his activities, Elena would gather evidence that could be used in whatever legal proceedings might follow. The cost was significant, but not prohibitive, and Elena offered payment plans for clients dealing with potential divorce situations. I signed the contract that afternoon, feeling simultaneously empowered and nauseated. Part of me still hoped desperately that Elena would call in a few days with news that David had indeed been in Portland, that there was some reasonable explanation for the Las Vegas receipt, that my marriage was exactly what I'd believed it to be. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since I'd found that receipt, suspected that Elena's investigation would confirm my worst fears. David returned from his Portland trip Wednesday evening, carrying his usual leather briefcase and looking tired but cheerful. He hugged me tight in the doorway, commented on how good the house smelled because I'd made his favorite chicken enchiladas, and spent the evening telling me about his meetings with a difficult client who kept changing project specifications. He showed me photos from his hotel room, a generic business-class space with bland artwork and polyester bedding. He'd brought me a small gift, a coffee mug from Powell's Books that he claimed he'd picked up during a free afternoon of sightseeing. Everything seemed normal, loving, genuine. David helped me clean up after dinner, asked about my week, made plans for us to visit his parents in Tucson the following weekend. We watched the news together, discussed a documentary we'd been meaning to watch, went to bed at our usual time. As David fell asleep beside me, one arm draped across my waist the way it had been for 8 years, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe I was paranoid, destructive, looking for problems that didn't exist. Maybe that receipt really had been a booking error, and I was about to ruin a good marriage based on unfounded suspicions. But 3 days later, Elena called with preliminary findings that shattered my remaining doubts. David had indeed flown to Portland on Sunday evening, just as he'd told me. But he'd returned to Phoenix on Monday afternoon, not Wednesday. Monday evening, he'd boarded another flight, this one to Las Vegas, where he'd checked into the Meridian Casino under his own name. He'd spent Monday and Tuesday nights there, returning to Phoenix Wednesday afternoon just hours before coming home to me with stories about his extended Portland conference. Elena had photos. David walking through McCarran Airport in Las Vegas with a small rolling suitcase. David entering the Meridian Casino lobby. David at a blackjack table, but not alone. There was a woman with him, someone I'd never seen before, someone who clearly wasn't a business colleague. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with long auburn hair and the kind of effortless style that suggested money and leisure time. In the photos, she was laughing at something David was saying, her hand resting casually on his arm, her body language intimate and familiar. Elena had more information. The woman's name was Jennifer Walsh, and she worked as an event coordinator for various Las Vegas hotels and casinos. She was single, lived in a luxury apartment near the Strip, and according to social media analysis, had been posting photos with David for several months, though she'd been careful not to tag him or use his name. Elena had found evidence of regular communication between them, hotel bookings that corresponded with David's supposed business trips, and financial records showing David had been spending considerable money during these Las Vegas visits. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. David wasn't just cheating on me. He'd constructed an elaborate double life, complete with fake business trips, careful financial planning, and a long-term relationship with another woman. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a one-time mistake. This was calculated, ongoing deception that had been happening for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Elena asked what I wanted to do with the information. I could confront David immediately, or I could wait and gather more evidence to strengthen my position in potential divorce proceedings. She also mentioned that David had another Portland trip scheduled for the following week, according to his company's travel calendar. If the pattern held, he'd likely detour to Las Vegas again, giving us another opportunity for documentation. I chose to wait, not because I had any hope of salvaging my marriage, but because I wanted to see just how deep David's deception went. I also wanted time to process what I'd learned, to make decisions about my future from a place of clarity rather than raw emotion. Rebecca helped me find a therapist, Lisa Kim, who specialized in marital betrayal and divorce transitions. Lisa's office became a safe space where I could express my anger, grief, and confusion without having to maintain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The facade of normalcy I wore at home with David. The following week was surreal. David prepared for his next Portland trip with the same routine he'd followed for 2 years. He packed his familiar black suitcase, printed his boarding passes, double-checked his presentation materials. Thursday morning, he kissed me goodbye at the front door and reminded me to water his tomato plants while he was gone. He promised to call that evening after his first day of meetings, and he told me he loved me with the same tone and expression he'd used throughout our marriage. I waited until his plane took off, then called Elena. The surveillance would begin immediately. David would be followed from the Phoenix airport to wherever he actually went, and I would have minute-by-minute documentation of his activities. This time there would be no ambiguity, no room for alternative explanations. By Sunday, I would know exactly who my husband really was. Friday afternoon, Elena sent me a text message that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped my phone. He's in Vegas. Meridian Casino. Same woman. More photos coming. The photos arrived an hour later. David and Jennifer Walsh checking into the casino hotel together, sharing a key card, David's arm around her waist as they walked toward the elevators. There were more photos from Friday evening. The two of them at dinner in one of the casino's upscale restaurants, holding hands across the table, David leaning in to whisper something that made Jennifer laugh. They looked comfortable together, natural, like a couple who'd been together for years rather than a man cheating on his wife of 8 years. Saturday brought more documentation. David and Jennifer at the hotel pool. Jennifer wearing a bikini that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. David applying sunscreen to her shoulders with the kind of casual intimacy that spoke of familiarity and routine. They went shopping at the Forum shops, David carrying Jennifer's bags, his credit card paying for purchases that would never appear in our joint checking account. Saturday evening, they attended a show, David's arm around Jennifer's shoulders, both of them dressed like they were celebrating something special. I spent that weekend in a strange state of emotional numbness. The evidence was so overwhelming, so unambiguous, that there was almost relief in finally knowing the truth. The months of subtle doubts, the feeling that something was slightly off in my marriage, the growing distance I'd attributed to work stress and everyday relationship challenges, all of it suddenly made sense. I wasn't losing my mind or being paranoid. My instincts had been correct, and David really was living a double life. Sunday evening, David called from what he claimed was his Portland hotel room. He sounded tired but cheerful, told me about a successful client presentation, complained about the restaurant in his hotel having terrible seafood. As he talked, I was looking at Elena's photos from that same time period. Images of David and Jennifer having brunch at a trendy Las Vegas cafe, both of them looking relaxed and happy. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The man on the phone, spinning elaborate lies about his weekend, was the same man I'd trusted completely. The man I'd planned to grow old with, the man whose children I'd hoped to raise. When David returned Monday evening, I was ready. Not ready to confront him, not yet, but ready to begin the next phase of what I now understood would be the end of our marriage. I'd spent Sunday researching divorce attorneys, reading articles about protecting assets during separation, and planning my exit strategy. I'd also called my brother Tom in Denver, telling him I might need a place to stay in the coming weeks. Tom didn't ask many questions, but he assured me I'd always have a place in his guest room, and whatever emotional support I needed. David's homecoming routine was exactly the same as always. He hugged me at the door, commented on how good the house smelled, unpacked his suitcase while telling me stories about his Portland meetings. He'd brought me another small gift, this time a package of specialty tea from a shop he claimed to have discovered during a lunch break. He seemed relaxed, affectionate, unchanged. If I hadn't seen Elena's photos, I would have believed every word he said. That night, as David fell asleep beside me for what I knew would be one of the last times, I made my final decision. I would give him one more chance to tell me the truth. I would ask him directly about his trips, about where he'd really been, about whether there was anything he needed to tell me about our marriage. If he continued lying, if he looked me in the eye and maintained his deception, then I would know with absolute certainty that our marriage was over. There would be no doubt, no second guessing, no wondering if I'd made the right choice. Tuesday morning, David was getting ready for work, standing in front of our bathroom mirror and adjusting his tie, when I asked the question that would change both our lives forever. David, I said, keeping my voice casual and non-accusatory, is there anything about your business trips that you think I should know about? David's reflection froze in the bathroom mirror. The electric toothbrush in his hand stopped mid-motion, and for just a heartbeat, I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt exactly, but recognition, like a deer sensing a predator nearby but not yet sure which direction the danger was coming from. He set the toothbrush down carefully, turned toward me with that practiced smile I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago, and said the words that confirmed everything I'd feared. "What do you mean, honey? My trips are just boring software conferences. You know how tedious those things are." But his voice carried a note I'd never heard before. A slight tightness, like he was choosing each word with unusual care. His eyes didn't quite meet mine the way they normally did during our morning conversations. Instead, they darted briefly to his phone on the counter, then back to my face, calculating something I couldn't name. I'd given him the perfect opening. A chance to come clean, to explain about Las Vegas, to tell me about Jennifer Walsh and whatever their relationship meant. Instead, he doubled down on the lie with such smooth confidence that I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. This wasn't panic or uncertainty. This was practiced deception from someone who'd become very comfortable lying to my face. "Just checking," I said, forcing my voice to remain light. "You've seemed a little stressed about work lately." I wanted to make sure everything was okay with the Portland account. David's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. He moved closer, placed his hands on my waist, and looked directly into my eyes with what I now recognized as manufactured sincerity. You're so thoughtful, Sarah. I love that about you. Work has been challenging, but nothing I can't handle. The Portland clients are demanding, but that's just business. He kissed my forehead, the same gentle gesture he'd made thousands of times throughout our marriage. But now it felt like a performance, a carefully choreographed moment designed to reassure me while protecting his secret life. As he gathered his briefcase and headed toward the garage, calling out his usual, "Love you, have a great day," I remained standing in our bathroom, staring at my reflection and finally accepting what I'd been avoiding for weeks. My husband had become a stranger. The rest of Tuesday passed in a surreal haze of ordinary activities that felt anything but ordinary. I designed a logo for a local veterinary clinic, answered emails about a potential website project, took Jasper for his afternoon walk through our neighborhood. But underneath every mundane task, my mind was processing the morning's conversation and what it revealed about the man I'd been married to for 8 years. David had lied to me with such ease, such apparent comfort, that it suggested extensive practice. This wasn't someone struggling with guilt or wrestling with the decision to confess. This was someone who'd made peace with deception, who'd developed systems and strategies for maintaining parallel lives. The David who kissed me goodbye every morning and the David who checked into Las Vegas hotels with another woman weren't two different people fighting for control. They were integrated parts of the same person who'd simply learned to compartmentalize his existence. That evening, David returned home with Chinese takeout from our favorite restaurant, a gesture that once would have felt romantic and thoughtful. He'd remembered to get extra spring rolls, the way I liked my fried rice prepared, and fortune cookies, even though we usually threw them away. We sat at our kitchen table, eating dinner and talking about our days, and everything felt like an elaborate theater production, where only one of us knew we were acting. David told me about a difficult client meeting, a software glitch that had required overtime to fix, his annoyance with a coworker who'd taken credit for someone else's idea. He asked about my design projects, listened attentively to my description of the veterinary clinic's branding needs, made suggestions about pricing strategy for the website proposal. He was charming, engaged, genuinely interested in my work and my thoughts. This was the David I'd fallen in love with, the man who remembered small details about my life and made me feel heard and valued. But I kept thinking about the photos Elena had sent. David and Jennifer at that Las Vegas restaurant, David's face animated with the same expressions he was showing me now. Which version was real? Was he performing for her the way he was performing for me? Or was I the one receiving the manufactured attention while she got his authentic self? After dinner, we settled onto our living room couch to watch a documentary about ocean conservation that we'd been meaning to see. David stretched out with his head in my lap, and I absently ran my fingers through his hair while my mind raced through increasingly dark possibilities. How long had this been going on? Were there other women besides Jennifer? Had there been signs earlier in our marriage that I'd missed or rationalized away? I found myself studying David's profile as he watched the television, memorizing details I'd taken for granted for years. The small scar on his chin from a childhood bicycle accident. The way his eyebrows drew together when he was concentrating. The unconscious habit he had of touching his wedding ring when he was relaxed. This was still my husband, the man who knew how I liked my coffee prepared, who brought me soup when I was sick, who'd held my hand during my father's funeral 2 years ago. But he was also someone who could lie to me with stunning ease while planning secret vacations with another woman. When we went to bed that night, David reached for me with what seemed like genuine affection. He pulled me close, whispered that he loved me, kissed my neck in the spot that usually made me melt against him. But instead of responding the way I had for 8 years, I found myself analyzing his touch, wondering if he'd kissed Jennifer the same way, just days earlier. The physical intimacy that had always felt natural, and right now felt contaminated by knowledge I couldn't ignore. I lay awake long after David's breathing deepened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the complete upheaval of everything I'd believed about my life. 24 hours earlier, I'd been a happily married woman with normal relationship concerns about work-life balance and whether we should refinish the hardwood floors. Now I was someone gathering evidence of my husband's infidelity while pretending everything was fine. Wednesday morning brought a text message from Elena that made my coffee cup rattle against the kitchen counter. David has booked another trip for next week, this time claiming Chicago for a 3-day conference. Want me to track his real destination? I stared at the message, feeling something cold and determined settle in my chest. Yes, I typed back. I want to know everything. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy and investigation. David went to work, came home for dinner, watched television with me in the evenings, and maintained the routine we'd established over years of marriage. But I was simultaneously living a parallel existence, coordinating with Elena, researching divorce attorneys, and slowly, carefully preparing for a future that didn't include the man sleeping beside me every night. I began paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way David's phone was always face down on surfaces, even when he was just setting it aside to eat dinner. How he had started taking his laptop into the bathroom when he showered, claiming he needed to charge it but always emerging with the screen closed. The subtle changes in his grooming habits, the new attention to his appearance that I'd attributed to professional advancement rather than romantic motivation. On Friday evening, David mentioned his upcoming Chicago trip while we were preparing dinner together. He would be presenting at a software security conference, he explained. 3 days of meetings with potential clients who were interested in expanding their cybersecurity infrastructure. It was a significant opportunity for the company, he said, the kind of conference that could lead to major contracts if he handled the presentations well. As he talked, I watched his face for signs of deception, but David had clearly perfected his lying technique. His voice carried appropriate enthusiasm for professional opportunities. His body language suggested mild anxiety about important presentations, and his eye contact remained steady and sincere. If I hadn't seen Elena's photos from Las Vegas, if I didn't know about Jennifer Walsh, I would have believed every word and probably wished him luck with genuine pride in his career advancement. When do you leave? I asked, slicing vegetables for the stir-fry we were making. Sunday afternoon, David replied, testing the oil temperature in our wok. The conference starts Monday morning, so I want to get there with time to review my materials and get a good night's sleep. I nodded, making mental notes. Elena would need David's flight information, hotel details, and any other specifics I could gather without arousing suspicion. This time, we would document everything from the moment he left Phoenix until the moment he returned. There would be no ambiguity about where he went or what he did. That weekend, David was particularly attentive. Saturday morning, he brought me coffee in bed and suggested we spend the day exploring Old Town Scottsdale, something we hadn't done together in months. We wandered through art galleries, shared lunch at a cafe with outdoor seating, and browsed through boutiques where David encouraged me to buy a dress I'd been admiring. He was charming, romantic, fully present in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his attention was motivated by guilt rather than genuine affection. Was this how David managed his conscience? Did he compensate for his deception by being an especially devoted husband during the times he was actually home? Or was I reading sinister motives into normal romantic gestures because I now knew about his secret life? Sunday morning, David packed for Chicago with his usual methodical approach. Clean shirts arranged carefully in his suitcase, toiletries organized in a leather kit I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, presentation materials double-checked and properly filed. He asked me to iron a shirt he particularly liked, claiming the hotel would charge too much for laundry service, and I found myself standing at our ironing board wondering if Jennifer Walsh would be the one seeing him wear it. At the airport, David hugged me goodbye with what felt like genuine reluctance to leave. He told me he'd miss me, promised to call every evening, and reminded me that his conference schedule might make communication irregular, but he'd do his best to check in frequently. As I watched him walk through security, wheeling the same black suitcase he'd taken on dozens of legitimate business trips, I felt something that surprised me. Not anger or betrayal, but a kind of sad curiosity about what would happen next. Would David actually fly to Chicago, then secretly detour to Las Vegas? Would he fabricate elaborate stories about conference presentations while spending 3 days with Jennifer? How extensive was the infrastructure he'd built to support this double life? And how long had he been refining his deception techniques? Elena called me within an hour of David's departure. He had indeed boarded a flight, but not to Chicago. The plane was headed to Las Vegas, just as we'd suspected. Elena was already in position to begin surveillance, and I would have real-time updates about David's activities from the moment he landed. Part 3. Character Foundation. The first photo arrived Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee and pretending to work on a logo design that I'd been staring at for an hour without making any progress. David and Jennifer Walsh walking hand in hand through the Meridian Casino lobby, both dressed casually but expensively, both looking like they belonged in the luxury resort atmosphere that was becoming their regular playground. But this photo was different from Elena's previous surveillance images. This time, Jennifer was wearing a ring on her left hand. Not a wedding band, but an elaborate diamond engagement ring that caught the casino's artificial lighting and sparkled with the kind of brilliance that suggested serious money and serious commitment. My phone rang immediately. Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the significance behind her professional tone. "Sarah, we need to talk about what I'm seeing here. This isn't just an affair. This appears to be a much more serious relationship than we initially documented." I set down my coffee cup, my hands steadier than I'd expected them to be. "What do you mean?" Jennifer Walsh is wearing an engagement ring, a new one, based on social media posts from last month. She's also checked into the hotel using a different last name, Jennifer Martinez. Your husband appears to have proposed to his girlfriend while he's still married to you. The words hit me like physical blows, but instead of the emotional devastation I'd expected to feel, I experienced something closer to analytical clarity. David hadn't just been cheating on me, he'd been planning to replace me. The secret trips, the careful financial management, the elaborate lies about business conferences, all of it had been preparation for a completely different life with a completely different woman. Elena continued with more details that painted an increasingly clear picture of David's deception. Jennifer had been posting social media content that suggested a long-term relationship with someone she referred to as her fiancé, though she'd been careful never to show his face or use his name. She'd been apartment hunting in Las Vegas neighborhoods that suggested substantial financial resources. She'd recently left her job as an event coordinator, apparently no longer needing employment income. "There's more," Elena said. "I've been tracking your husband's financial activity, and he's been moving money systematically. Small amounts, transferred regularly to accounts that don't appear on your joint banking statements. He's been building a financial foundation for a second life." I found myself taking notes as Elena talked, writing down details with the same methodical approach I used for client projects. David had opened credit cards I didn't know about. He'd been claiming business expenses that were actually personal spending in Las Vegas. He'd even established a post office box in Henderson, Nevada, apparently for mail he didn't want delivered to our Scottsdale home. The scope of his planning was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated exit strategy from our marriage, complete with financial preparation, legal groundwork, and emotional investment in a replacement relationship. David had been living a double life for months, possibly years, while maintaining the facade of our marriage with skill that suggested extensive practice in deception. Elena sent more photos throughout the day. David and Jennifer at breakfast, looking comfortable and domestic. David and Jennifer shopping for furniture at a high-end store in Las Vegas. Jennifer pointing at items, while David nodded and smiled. David and Jennifer at what appeared to be a real estate office, both of them leaning over paperwork, while a woman in a business suit pointed at documents. Each image told a story of a couple making serious plans for a shared future. These weren't the activities of someone having a casual affair. These were the activities of someone building a new life with someone new, while keeping his existing wife completely unaware of his intentions. Tuesday evening, David called me from what he claimed was his Chicago hotel room. His voice was warm and familiar, asking about my day, telling me about successful client presentations and networking opportunities. He complained about the conference center's air conditioning, praised a restaurant the hotel had recommended, and promised to bring me a small gift from a Chicago boutique he'd discovered. As he talked, I was looking at Elena's most recent photos. Images of David and Jennifer having dinner at an upscale Las Vegas restaurant, both of them looking relaxed and happy. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that I found myself almost admiring David's ability to maintain completely separate realities with such apparent ease. "How was your presentation today?" I asked, genuinely curious about how elaborate his fictional conference would become. David launched into a detailed description of client meetings that had never happened, technical challenges he'd supposedly overcome, and positive feedback from conference attendees who didn't exist. He spoke with enthusiasm and confidence, providing specific details that made his lies sound completely plausible. If I'd had any remaining doubts about the extent of his deception, this phone call eliminated them entirely. When we hung up, I sat in our living room surrounded by the familiar objects of our shared life. Wedding photos on the mantle, vacation souvenirs on the bookshelf, furniture we'd chosen together, artwork I'd designed and David had helped hang. Everything in our house told the story of a couple building a life together, making plans for the future, creating a home that reflected their shared values and dreams. But David had been creating a different home with different dreams, while maintaining this one as an elaborate cover story. He'd been kissing me goodbye every morning while planning a future that didn't include me. He'd been sleeping beside me every night while emotionally investing in someone else. The man I'd been married to for 8 years had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of deception so extensive that it amounted to living multiple lives simultaneously. Wednesday morning brought news that changed everything I thought I understood about David's plans. Elena called with information that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair, my morning coffee forgotten as I processed what she was telling me. "Sarah, I need you to hear this carefully. Your husband and Jennifer Walsh met with a divorce attorney yesterday. Not just any attorney, but someone who specializes in complex asset division and high net worth separations. They spent 2 hours in that office, and Jennifer came out carrying a folder of paperwork." My mouth went completely dry. A divorce attorney? It gets worse. I've been doing more research into their relationship timeline, and I think David has been planning this for much longer than we realized. Jennifer's social media shows evidence of a serious relationship going back at least 18 months. They've been together longer than they've been hiding it. Elena paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, I think your husband has been planning to divorce you all along. The business trips, the financial planning, the careful emotional investment in another relationship, all of it suggests someone who's been methodically preparing to end his marriage while maintaining complete control over the timeline and circumstances." I found myself thinking about conversations David and I had over the past year, times when he'd seemed distant or preoccupied, moments when I'd attributed his behavior to work stress or normal relationship rhythms. Had he been thinking about Jennifer during those conversations? Had he been comparing our life together to the life he was building with someone else? "There's something else," Elena continued. "The attorney they met with has a reputation for helping clients maximize their financial position during divorce proceedings. He specializes in cases where one spouse has significantly more assets or earning potential than the other. David may be planning to position himself as the financially disadvantaged party in your divorce." The irony was stunning. David, who had been systematically hiding money and building secret financial resources, was apparently planning to claim that I was the one with greater assets during our divorce. He knew about my growing graphic design business, the potential contracts I'd been pursuing, the small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother's estate. Was he planning to use my professional success against me while concealing his own financial preparations? Elena's investigation had revealed someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of long-term strategic thinking about ending our marriage while maintaining an appearance of commitment and love. This wasn't someone who'd fallen in love with another woman and was struggling with guilt about betraying his wife. This was someone who'd made calculated decisions about replacing his current life with a better one, and who'd been implementing those decisions with methodical precision. That afternoon, I called Rebecca and asked her to meet me for coffee. I needed to talk to someone who knew me well, someone who could help me process the complete reconfiguration of everything I'd believed about my marriage and my husband. Rebecca listened without interruption as I described Elena's findings, her expression growing increasingly serious as the scope of David's deception became clear. "Sarah," she said finally, "this isn't just cheating. This is fraud. He's been stealing from your marriage, lying about his intentions, and planning to leave you in the worst possible financial and emotional position. You need to protect yourself immediately." Rebecca was right, but protection required acknowledging that my marriage was over, that the man I'd been living with was someone I'd never really known. It required accepting that 8 years of shared life had been, at least partially, an elaborate performance designed to maintain his comfort while he planned his escape. That evening, David called again with more fictional updates from his non-existent Chicago conference. He sounded tired but satisfied, describing successful client meetings and promising developments for his company's future. He asked about my day with apparent genuine interest, listened to my description of a challenging logo project, and made suggestions that demonstrated real understanding of my work and my creative process. As we talked, I found myself wondering which version of David was real. The caring husband who remembered details about my projects and offered thoughtful advice? Or the calculating stranger who was meeting with divorce attorneys while telling me about business conferences? Had he ever been the person I thought I'd married? Or had I been living with an illusion for our entire relationship? Part 4, The Awakening. Thursday morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I drove to Valley Legal Associates and sat across from Marcus Thompson, a divorce attorney Rebecca had recommended, to discuss protecting myself from a husband who was planning to destroy our marriage while pretending to preserve it. Marcus was probably in his early 50s, with gray temples and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd guided many people through similar betrayals. His office was comfortable but professional, with family photos that reminded me of the life I'd thought I was building with David. As I described Elena's findings, Marcus took notes and asked questions that revealed the true scope of what David had been planning. "Mrs. Martinez," Marcus said carefully, "based on what you're telling me, your husband has been preparing for divorce while deliberately keeping you unaware of his intentions. In Arizona, this kind of deception can have serious legal consequences, especially if he's been hiding assets or misrepresenting his financial situation." Marcus explained that Arizona was a community property state, which meant that assets acquired during marriage were generally split equally between spouses during divorce. But David's secret financial planning, his hidden accounts, and undisclosed spending constituted a deliberate attempt to circumvent that legal protection. If we could document his financial deception, I might be entitled to more than half of our marital assets as compensation for his fraudulent behavior. "The key," Marcus continued, "is documentation. The more evidence we have of his deception, the stronger your position will be when this inevitably comes to court. The private investigator you've hired is providing excellent information, but we need to be strategic about how we use it." Marcus recommended that I continue allowing David to believe his secret was safe while Elena documented everything. We needed evidence of his financial deception, his relationship with Jennifer, and his meetings with divorce attorneys. Most importantly, we needed to protect my assets and prepare for David's eventual attempt to end our marriage on his terms rather than mine. "He's planning to control the narrative," Marcus warned. "Men like your husband often present themselves as the victims of failed marriages, claiming their wives were impossible to live with or threatening divorce themselves to maintain the upper hand. We need to be ready for that strategy." As I drove home from Marcus's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of agency. For the first time since finding that Las Vegas receipt, I wasn't just reacting to David's deception. I was taking control of my situation and preparing to protect myself from someone who'd been planning to hurt me while pretending to love me. Elena called that afternoon with updates that confirmed my worst suspicions about David's timeline. She'd managed to access some of Jennifer's older social media posts, and the evidence suggested their relationship had been serious for nearly 2 years. Photos from 18 months ago showed Jennifer wearing jewelry that Elena had traced to expensive Las Vegas boutiques. Posts from a year ago included references to a, quote, special someone who was worth waiting for despite, quote, complicated circumstances. David had been living a double life for most of our marriage, not just the past few months. While I'd been planning our future, discussing potential home renovations and whether we were ready to start a family, David had been investing emotionally and financially in someone else. Every conversation we'd had about our relationship, every decision we'd made together, had been contaminated by his secret commitments to another woman. Elena also had information about David's financial planning that revealed the true scope of his preparation. He'd been systematically underreporting his income on our joint tax returns, while hiding additional earnings in accounts I'd never seen. He'd been claiming business expenses that were actually personal spending in Las Vegas. He'd even taken out a life insurance policy with Jennifer as the beneficiary, while maintaining our joint policy that named me. "Sarah," Elena said, "your husband has been planning this for a very long time. This isn't someone who fell in love with another woman and got carried away. This is someone who made a calculated decision to replace his current life and has been implementing that decision with careful planning and attention to detail." The methodical nature of David's deception was almost more disturbing than the infidelity itself. He'd been able to maintain our marriage, to seem loving and committed, while simultaneously building a completely different life with someone else. He'd been sleeping beside me every night while planning a future that didn't include me. He'd been making love to me while financially preparing to abandon me. That evening, David returned from his fictional Chicago conference with a small gift and elaborate stories about successful client presentations. He'd brought me a coffee table book about Chicago architecture, claiming he'd found it at a boutique near his hotel and thought I'd appreciate the design photography. As he showed me pictures he'd supposedly taken at the conference, I was simultaneously receiving Elena's surveillance photos showing him and Jennifer at Las Vegas restaurants and shops. The gift was particularly painful because it demonstrated how well David knew my interests and preferences. He'd chosen something I genuinely liked, something that showed attention to my professional interests and personal taste. But the thoughtfulness was contaminated by the lies surrounding it. Had he bought the book during a real trip to Chicago months ago, keeping it for an occasion when he needed a prop for his fictional conference? Or had he purchased it online, planning ahead for the story he would tell about his secret weekend with another woman? As David unpacked his suitcase and described his trip, I found myself studying his performance with new appreciation for its sophistication. He had details about restaurants he'd never visited, complaints about hotel services he'd never experienced, and enthusiasm about business contacts he'd never met. His lies weren't just convincing. They were creative, well-researched, and delivered with the kind of confidence that suggested extensive practice. "How was the presentation on cybersecurity protocols?" I asked, remembering a topic he'd mentioned before leaving. David launched into a detailed description of a presentation he'd never given, complete with questions from an audience that had never existed, and positive feedback from potential clients he'd never met. He spoke with genuine enthusiasm about technical challenges and solutions, drawing on his real expertise to make his fictional conference sound completely plausible. I realized that David's professional knowledge made his lies particularly effective. He wasn't just making up generic business trip stories. He was crafting deceptions that drew on his actual skills and experience. His fictional conferences sounded real because they were based on real industry knowledge, real client challenges, and real business dynamics. The only thing fictional was his attendance. When we went to bed that night, David was particularly affectionate. He held me close, told me how much he'd missed me, and made love to me with what seemed like genuine passion and connection. But I found myself wondering if his physical intimacy was motivated by guilt, by comparison to his time with Jennifer, or by some psychological need to maintain the illusion of our marriage even in our most private moments. As David fell asleep beside me, I lay awake thinking about the complete transformation of my understanding of our relationship. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been a happily married woman with normal concerns about work-life balance and household responsibilities. Now I was someone gathering evidence of systematic betrayal while pretending everything was normal. But I was also someone taking control of my situation instead of remaining a victim of someone else's deception. Marcus had given me legal strategies for protecting myself. Elena was documenting David's lies and building a case that would support me during divorce proceedings. I was no longer the naive wife who'd found a suspicious receipt and wondered if she was being paranoid. Friday morning, I made another decision that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. I opened my own bank account, separate from our joint finances, and began transferring money to protect myself from David's financial planning. Marcus had advised me to secure my assets before David realized I knew about his secret life, and I was finally ready to take that step. As I sat in the bank signing paperwork for an account David would never know about, I felt something that surprised me. Not sadness or anger, but relief. For the first time in weeks, I was taking action instead of just reacting. I was protecting myself instead of just gathering evidence. I was planning my own future instead of just documenting David's betrayal. The awakening wasn't just about understanding David's deception. It was about understanding my own strength, my own worth, and my own capacity to survive the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my marriage. David had underestimated me, assuming I would remain the trusting wife who never questioned his stories or challenged his authority. But he was about to discover that underestimating your spouse is a dangerous mistake when that spouse has access to private investigators, divorce attorneys, and her own financial resources. Part 5. The Hidden Preparation. That weekend, while David worked in our home office on what he claimed was a critical project proposal, I began my own secret project in the spare bedroom he rarely entered. Elena had provided me with detailed financial records showing the full scope of David's hidden assets, and Marcus had given me specific instructions about how to protect myself legally and financially before David realized I knew about his double life. I spent Saturday afternoon photographing important documents while David was outside trimming our hedges. Our marriage certificate, joint tax returns, bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to our house, titles to our vehicles, investment account statements, and every piece of paperwork that established our shared financial life. Marcus had emphasized that documentation would be crucial when David inevitably tried to claim I was being unreasonable or demanding more than my fair share during divorce proceedings. As I worked, I found myself discovering details about our finances that I'd never paid attention to before. David had always handled our tax preparation, claiming it was easier for one person to manage the complex paperwork required for his business expenses and my freelance income. But now I realized his control over our financial documentation had given him opportunities to hide income and assets I'd never known existed. There were business expense deductions I couldn't trace to actual purchases, investment accounts with statements showing withdrawals I'd never approved, credit cards with balances that didn't match any spending I could remember. David had been using his financial expertise to create a maze of assets and obligations that would be difficult for me to understand without professional help. Elena called Sunday morning with information that made my documentary project even more urgent. She'd discovered that David had recently met with a financial advisor in Las Vegas, someone who specialized in helping people relocate assets to Nevada, a state with more favorable laws for protecting wealth during divorce proceedings. David wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me with as little financial security as possible. "Sarah," Elena said, "your husband has been preparing for this divorce longer and more thoroughly than most people prepare for marriage. He's been consulting with experts, moving money strategically, and building legal protections that will make it very difficult for you to claim your fair share of marital assets." Elena had photos from David's meeting with the financial advisor, images that showed him reviewing documents and taking notes while a well-dressed woman pointed at charts and graphs. This wasn't someone getting casual advice about investment strategies. This was someone receiving specific guidance about how to minimize his financial obligations to a spouse he was planning to abandon. But Elena also had good news. David's careful planning had created a detailed paper trail that could be used against him in court. Every secret account, every hidden transfer, every undisclosed asset represented evidence of his intent to defraud me during divorce proceedings. His sophistication in financial planning would ultimately work in my favor if we could document it properly. "The key," Elena explained, "is that he's been doing this while still married to you, while still sharing joint financial obligations, and while actively deceiving you about his intentions. In Arizona, that kind of behavior can result in significant financial penalties beyond just splitting marital assets equally." I spent Sunday evening creating my own financial strategy with Marcus's guidance. Opening additional bank accounts, transferring money to protect my business assets, researching credit reporting services to monitor any accounts David might try to open in my name. For someone who'd always trusted her husband to handle complex financial decisions, I was learning to become financially independent with surprising speed. Marcus had also given me homework that felt surreal but necessary. I needed to document our marriage for potential court proceedings, creating a timeline of our relationship that could counter whatever narrative David would eventually present. When had he become distant? What changes in behavior could I identify in retrospect? Were there conversations or incidents that now seemed significant in light of his secret planning? As I worked on this relationship timeline, I began recognizing patterns I'd missed while living through them. David's increased attention to his appearance hadn't started recently. It had been gradual over nearly 2 years. His complaints about work stress and demanding clients had intensified around the same time Elena estimated his relationship with Jennifer had become serious. His decreased interest in making long-term plans for our house and our future now seemed like obvious signs that he'd been making different long-term plans with someone else. Most painfully, I realized that David's increased affection and attention during the times he was home hadn't been genuine romance. It had been guilt management. He'd been especially loving after returning from his secret Las Vegas trips, bringing me gifts and planning special evenings together as a way of managing his own psychological discomfort with his deception. Monday morning, I took another step that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I called David's office and spoke directly with his boss, Michael Barnes, claiming I was planning a surprise for David's upcoming birthday and wanted to coordinate around his travel schedule. Michael was friendly and helpful, providing me with information that confirmed Elena's surveillance findings. David's legitimate business travel was much less frequent than he'd been claiming. The Portland trips that had supposedly been happening monthly were actually quarterly meetings that lasted only 1 day. The Chicago conference he'd supposedly attended the previous week didn't exist on any industry calendar Michael was aware of. Actually, Michael said, David has been requesting a lot more travel lately, claiming he's identified new client opportunities that require face-to-face meetings. We've been happy to approve the expenses because his success rate with new contracts has been impressive. David had been using his professional reputation and his company's trust to fund his secret life. Every fake business trip was being paid for by his employer. Every hidden expense was being covered by legitimate business accounts. He'd been systematically defrauding not just me, but also the company that employed him and trusted him to represent their interests professionally. That afternoon, Elena provided me with the most damaging evidence yet of David's deception. She'd managed to access some of David's communication with Jennifer, and the content revealed the true nature of their relationship and his intentions regarding our marriage. In text messages dating back over a year, David had been making promises to Jennifer about their future together, while simultaneously making plans with me for renovating our house and potentially starting a family. He'd been telling Jennifer that he was working on ending his marriage, that he needed to, quote, handle things carefully to avoid financial complications, and that he was almost ready to begin their new life together. But the most devastating message was one David had sent just 2 weeks earlier, after returning from one of his Las Vegas trips. Sarah still doesn't suspect anything. I've got maybe 6 more months before I need to make this official. That should be enough time to get everything positioned the way we discussed. David had been giving himself a timeline for destroying our marriage while keeping me completely unaware of his intentions. He'd been calculating exactly how long he could maintain his deception while completing his financial and legal preparations. I wasn't just his wife. I was an obstacle to be managed until he was ready to discard me. Elena also had evidence that David and Jennifer had been making specific plans for their future that involved substantial financial resources I'd never known David possessed. They'd been looking at houses in expensive Las Vegas neighborhoods, planning vacations to destinations that would require far more money than David's legitimate salary could support, and discussing investment opportunities that suggested access to hidden assets. The financial planning David had been doing wasn't just about protecting his money during a divorce. It was about funding an entirely new lifestyle with Jennifer that would be significantly more expensive than the life we'd been living together. They'd been planning to buy a house that cost 3 times what our Scottsdale home was worth. They'd been discussing private vacation rentals, expensive restaurants, and luxury purchases that indicated David had access to substantially more money than I'd ever known about. Elena's investigation had revealed that David's secret financial resources came from multiple sources. He'd been skimming money from his legitimate business expenses for nearly 2 years, claiming reimbursements for travel and entertainment that either hadn't happened or had cost significantly less than he'd reported. He'd been working side consulting contracts that he'd never disclosed, earning income that never appeared on our joint tax returns. He'd even been investing in cryptocurrency and other assets using money he'd systematically diverted from our shared finances. The scope of his financial deception was staggering. David hadn't just been preparing to leave me. He'd been stealing from our marriage to fund his preparations. Every dollar he'd hidden was money that should have been part of our shared financial planning. Every secret investment was an asset that legally belonged to both of us. Every undisclosed income source was a violation of the financial trust that marriage requires. Tuesday evening, David called from another fictional business trip, this time claiming to be in Denver, meeting with potential clients about a major software implementation project. His voice was warm and familiar as he described his day, asking about my design projects, and listening with apparent genuine interest to my description of a challenging branding assignment. But while David was telling me about his successful meetings in Denver, Elena's surveillance showed him and Jennifer shopping for engagement announcements at a high-end Las Vegas print shop. They were planning a formal announcement of their engagement, complete with professional photography and mailed invitations to friends and family I'd never heard of. David was simultaneously planning his wedding to another woman while maintaining the fiction of his marriage to me. Elena had managed to photograph some of the engagement announcement materials, and the language was particularly painful to read. David and Jennifer were presenting themselves as a couple who'd overcome challenges to find true love, who were excited to begin their journey together after waiting for the right time to make their relationship public. There was no mention of David's existing marriage, no acknowledgement that his ability to marry Jennifer would require divorcing someone else first. The engagement announcement included biographical information about both David and Jennifer that painted them as successful professionals who'd found each other after previous relationships hadn't worked out. David was described as a software executive with expertise in cybersecurity and business development. Jennifer was presented as an event management entrepreneur who'd recently launched her own consulting firm. Both descriptions were technically accurate, but completely omitted the crucial detail that David was currently married to someone else. Elena also discovered that David and Jennifer had set a wedding date for the following spring, just 8 months away. They'd already placed deposits on venues, catering, and photography services. They'd registered for gifts at expensive stores and begun planning a honeymoon in Europe that would cost more than David and I had ever spent on a vacation together. David was planning his future with meticulous attention to detail while maintaining complete deception about his current circumstances. Wednesday morning brought a realization that changed my understanding of David's timeline completely. Elena called with information about David's employment situation that explained how he'd been funding his double life and why he was confident about his ability to support an expensive lifestyle with Jennifer. "Sarah," Elena said, "your husband has been negotiating a new job with a Las Vegas technology company. Not just any job, but a senior executive position that would pay significantly more than his current salary. He's been interviewing secretly for months, and according to my sources, he's expected to receive an offer within the next few weeks." David hadn't just been planning to leave me for another woman. He'd been planning to relocate to Las Vegas for a career advancement that would dramatically increase his income, while making it nearly impossible for me to monitor his financial activities or maintain any connection to his new life. His business trips to Las Vegas hadn't just been romantic getaways with Jennifer. They'd been job interviews and career planning sessions designed to establish his professional credentials in his new city. Elena had documentation showing that David's potential new employer was aware of his current Arizona residence, but apparently unaware of his marital status. During his interviews, David had presented himself as someone free to relocate immediately for the right opportunity. He'd provided references from his current job, described his career goals with enthusiasm, and demonstrated technical expertise that made him an attractive candidate for senior management positions. But most significantly, Elena had discovered that David's new job would include stock options, profit sharing, and other compensation benefits that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next few years. David wasn't just planning to start over financially, he was planning to become substantially wealthier than he'd ever been during our marriage. And he was planning to achieve this wealth while abandoning the wife who'd supported his career development for 8 years. The betrayal was comprehensive. David had used our marriage as a stable foundation while he built professional credentials, gained industry experience, and developed the expertise that was now making him attractive to higher-paying employers. I'd supported his career advancement, encouraged his professional development, and celebrated his successes, without ever suspecting that his ultimate goal was to use those achievements to fund a life that didn't include me. Wednesday afternoon, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I called David's current office and scheduled a meeting with his boss, Michael Barnes, claiming I had important information about David's employment situation that needed to be discussed confidentially. Michael agreed to meet with me Thursday morning, and I spent Wednesday evening preparing for a conversation that would expose David's deception to his current employer. Marcus had advised me that David's use of company resources to fund his personal activities could constitute fraud, and that his secret job negotiations could violate the terms of his current employment contract. If David was planning to use his position at TechFlow Solutions to fund his transition to a new life, his employer deserved to know about his divided loyalties and questionable expense claims. Elena provided me with documentation that would support my claims about David's misuse of company resources. Expense reports that claimed reimbursement for business meetings that were actually romantic dinners with Jennifer. Travel expenses for conferences that didn't exist, or presentations that were never given. Even equipment purchases that had been charged to his business account, but delivered to addresses in Las Vegas, rather than our Scottsdale home. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. David had been systematically defrauding his current employer, while secretly negotiating with a competitor in another state. He'd been using company money to fund his relationship with Jennifer while using company travel policies to conceal his whereabouts from me. His professional misconduct was as extensive as his personal betrayal. Thursday morning, I sat in Michael Barnes's office feeling nervous but determined. Michael was a pleasant man in his early 60s who'd always been friendly during company social events and holiday parties. He'd hired David 4 years earlier and had consistently praised his technical expertise and professional development. But Michael's expression grew increasingly serious as I described Elena's findings and presented the documentation she'd gathered. "Mrs. Martinez," Michael said finally, "if what you're telling me is accurate, David has been violating multiple company policies and potentially engaging in criminal fraud. We'll need to conduct an immediate internal investigation and review all of his expense reports and travel claims for the past 2 years." Michael was particularly concerned about David's secret job negotiations with a Las Vegas company that competed directly with TechFlow Solutions for certain types of contracts. David's current employment contract included non-compete clauses and confidentiality agreements that prohibited him from sharing proprietary information with competitors or pursuing employment opportunities that could compromise his current employer's business interests. "The most serious issue," Michael explained, "is that David has been using our resources and our trust to pursue opportunities with a direct competitor while actively deceiving us about his intentions. That kind of behavior could result in immediate termination and potential legal action to recover damages and protect our proprietary information." Michael promised to handle the investigation discreetly and professionally, but he warned me that the consequences for David could be severe. If the evidence supported the claims I was making, David could face not only termination, but also legal liability for the money he'd stolen and the confidential information he'd potentially compromised. As I left Michael's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of justice beginning to emerge. David had assumed he could deceive everyone in his life without consequences, that his careful planning and sophisticated lies would protect him from accountability. But his arrogance had created vulnerabilities that were now being exposed by people he'd underestimated. Elena called that afternoon with news that confirmed David's employment situation was about to become much more complicated. The Las Vegas company that had been courting him had apparently conducted their own background investigation and discovered some inconsistencies in David's professional presentation. They'd learned about his current marriage and his ongoing residence in Arizona, information that contradicted the impression he'd given during interviews about his availability for immediate relocation. "Companies don't like being lied to during the hiring process," Elena explained. David's potential new employer is now questioning his honesty about other aspects of his background and qualifications. They've delayed making a job offer pending additional reference checks and verification of his claims about his current employment situation. David's carefully constructed plan was beginning to unravel. His secret job negotiations were stalling because of his deception about his personal circumstances. His current employment was under investigation because of his misuse of company resources. His financial planning was being documented by a private investigator who could provide evidence for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. And his wife was no longer the naive woman who trusted his stories about business conferences and client meetings. Thursday evening, David called from his fictional Denver business trip with news that he was extending his stay by one additional day to pursue a promising new client opportunity. His voice carried the same confidence and enthusiasm he'd always shown when discussing professional developments, but I now understood that everything he was telling me was carefully constructed fiction designed to conceal his real activities. While David was describing his successful client presentations in Denver, Elena's surveillance showed him and Jennifer meeting with a wedding planner in Las Vegas, reviewing venue options and discussing catering arrangements for their spring ceremony. They were making final decisions about their wedding while David was simultaneously lying to me about business meetings that would never appear on any company calendar. Elena also had disturbing news about David's timeline for ending our marriage. Based on conversations she'd overheard and documents she'd photographed, David was planning to file for divorce immediately after securing his new job in Las Vegas. He'd apparently calculated that the timing would give him maximum leverage during asset division proceedings, while minimizing his financial obligations to me. Sarah, Elena said, "Your husband has been planning to present himself as someone whose career prospects were damaged by an unhappy marriage, someone who needs to relocate for professional opportunities that his current wife is unreasonably opposing. He's been preparing to claim that you're the obstacle to his career advancement and financial success." David's strategy was sophisticated and potentially effective. By securing a higher-paying job in another state, he could argue that his increased earning potential should be considered separate from marital assets. By claiming that I was opposing his career advancement, he could position himself as the victim of an unreasonable spouse who was preventing him from achieving his professional goals. By relocating to Nevada, he could take advantage of that state's more favorable laws for protecting individual assets during divorce proceedings. But David's strategy depended on maintaining control over the timing and circumstances of our divorce. He needed to file for divorce on his terms, at the moment that would maximize his advantage and minimize mine. He needed to control the narrative about why our marriage was ending and who was responsible for its failure. Most importantly, he needed me to remain unaware of his planning until he was ready to execute his strategy. David had seriously underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and my determination to protect myself from his deception. While he'd been planning to blindside me with divorce papers after establishing himself in Las Vegas, I'd been gathering evidence that would expose his fraud and strengthen my position during any legal proceedings. While he'd been assuming I would react emotionally to his betrayal, I'd been building a rational, strategic response that would hold him accountable for his actions. Friday morning, I received the call that marked the beginning of the end of David's carefully constructed deception. Michael Barnes called to inform me that TechFlow Solutions' internal investigation had confirmed my allegations about David's misuse of company resources and his secret job negotiations with a competitor. "Mrs. Martinez," Michael said, "we've terminated David's employment effective immediately. Security has been notified to retrieve his company equipment and revoke his access to all systems and facilities. We've also referred the matter to our legal department for potential criminal prosecution related to the financial fraud we've documented." Michael explained that David's expense account irregularities totaled more than $30,000 over the past 18 months, money that he'd claimed for business purposes but had actually used for personal activities in Las Vegas. The company was also concerned about potential theft of proprietary information, since David had been downloading client files and technical documentation that he had no legitimate reason to access. "We're particularly concerned," Michael continued, "because David had access to sensitive client information and pricing strategies that would be valuable to competitors. His secret negotiations with a Las Vegas company suggest he may have been planning to use our confidential information to advance his career with a competitor." David's professional reputation was being destroyed at the same moment his personal deception was being fully documented. The man who'd been confident about his ability to control his future was about to discover that underestimating the people around him had been a catastrophic mistake. Elena called within an hour of Michael's conversation with news that would complete the destruction of David's plans. David's potential employer in Las Vegas had withdrawn their job offer after learning about his termination from TechFlow Solutions and the allegations of fraud and theft that had prompted his firing. "Sarah," Elena said, "your husband's career prospects have just been severely damaged. Word travels fast in the technology industry, especially when someone is terminated for fraud. Other potential employers are going to be very reluctant to hire someone with David's recent employment history." David's financial foundation for his new life with Jennifer was crumbling. Without the high-paying Las Vegas job he'd been counting on, he couldn't afford the expensive lifestyle they'd been planning. Without access to company resources, he couldn't continue funding his relationship through fraudulent expense claims. Without the legitimate employment that had provided cover for his secret activities, he would have difficulty maintaining any kind of professional credibility. Elena also had news about Jennifer's reaction to David's employment crisis. Surveillance from that morning showed Jennifer and David having what appeared to be a very serious conversation in a Las Vegas coffee shop, with Jennifer looking increasingly upset as David presumably explained his situation. After their conversation, Jennifer had returned to her apartment alone while David had gone to the airport earlier than scheduled. "I think David is about to discover that his girlfriend's commitment to their relationship was significantly influenced by his professional success and earning potential," Elena observed. "Jennifer doesn't appear to be someone who's prepared to support an unemployed man with potential criminal charges pending." David was returning to Phoenix a day early, his fictional Denver business trip cut short by professional and personal crises he hadn't anticipated. He would be arriving home to a wife who knew everything about his deception and was prepared to hold him accountable for his betrayal. His carefully planned future was collapsing, and he had no idea that the collapse had been accelerated by people he'd assumed would never discover his secrets or challenge his authority. Friday afternoon, I made my final preparations for David's homecoming. Marcus had provided me with divorce papers that would be served immediately after David arrived home, catching him at his most vulnerable moment when he was dealing with the loss of his job and the potential collapse of his relationship with Jennifer. Elena had organized all of her surveillance evidence into a comprehensive report that documented every aspect of David's deception, and I had prepared myself emotionally for the confrontation that would finally bring David's elaborate lies into the open. As I waited in our living room, surrounded by the familiar objects of our shared life, I reflected on how completely my understanding of reality had changed over the past month. 4 weeks earlier, I'd been a trusting wife who'd found a suspicious hotel receipt and wondered if she was being paranoid. Now I was a woman who'd gathered evidence of systematic betrayal, protected her assets from financial fraud, and prepared to end a marriage that had been built on lies. David had assumed that his intelligence, his planning, and his ability to deceive would protect him from consequences. He'd underestimated the people around him, believing that his wife would remain naive, his employer would remain trusting, and his girlfriend would remain loyal regardless of his circumstances. But David was about to discover that underestimating people is dangerous, especially when those people have access to private investigators, divorce attorneys, and their own capacity for strategic thinking. The sound of David's key in the front door marked the end of his double life, and the beginning of his accountability for everything he'd done to destroy our marriage while pretending to preserve it. David walked through our front door at 4:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, his familiar black suitcase rolling behind him, his shoulders slightly hunched in a way I'd never seen before. He looked exhausted, defeated, nothing like the confident man who'd left for his fictional Denver business trip just 3 days earlier. His phone had been buzzing constantly during his drive home from the airport, and I could see the stress etched in the lines around his eyes as he set his briefcase down in our entryway. "Hey, honey," he said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "I'm home a little early. The client meetings wrapped up sooner than expected." I remained seated on our living room couch, my laptop open in front of me, Elena's surveillance photos displayed on the screen in a neat digital gallery that told the complete story of his deception. David couldn't see the images from where he stood, but I could see every detail of his last 3 days with Jennifer Walsh. The coffee shop conversation where she'd clearly given him an ultimatum. The airport security footage showing him boarding his flight alone, no longer the confident man who'd been planning a wedding with another woman. "How did the client presentation go?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. David paused in the middle of hanging up his jacket, his hand frozen on the closet door handle. Something in my tone must have registered as different, because he turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but wariness, like he was suddenly uncertain about something he'd previously taken for granted. "It went well," he said slowly. "Really well, actually." The client was impressed with our cybersecurity recommendations, and they're interested in moving forward with a comprehensive implementation plan. I nodded thoughtfully, as if processing this information. "That's wonderful news. I'm sure Michael Barnes will be pleased to hear about your success." David's face went completely pale. The color drained from his skin so rapidly that I thought he might actually faint right there in our entryway. His hand gripped the closet door for support, and I could see his mind racing as he tried to understand how I might know about his employment situation. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean that Michael Barnes called me this morning to let me know that TechFlow Solutions terminated your employment for fraud and theft. He wanted to make sure I was aware that you'd been stealing company money to fund your relationship with Jennifer Walsh in Las Vegas." David's suitcase toppled over as he stumbled backward, his carefully constructed world crashing down around him with devastating swiftness. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in our 8-year marriage, David Martinez was completely speechless. I stood up from the couch, closing my laptop with deliberate calm. "I know about Jennifer, David. I know about the engagement ring, the wedding planning, the house hunting, the financial accounts you've been hiding, and the job you were supposed to start in Las Vegas next month. I know about every lie you've told me for the past 2 years." David's legs gave out completely, and he sank onto the bottom step of our staircase, his head in his hands. "Sarah, I can explain. It's not what you think. I never meant for any of this to happen." "You never meant for me to find out," I corrected. "There's a difference." I walked to the kitchen island where I'd arranged the documents that would define the next chapter of both our lives. Elena's surveillance report, Marcus's divorce papers, bank statements showing David's hidden accounts, and copies of the evidence that had led to his termination from TechFlow Solutions. The paperwork was organized with the same methodical attention to detail that David had used to plan his betrayal. "I hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago," I said, returning to the living room with the folder of evidence. "Elena Rodriguez has been documenting your activities since your supposed Portland conference in October. She has photos, financial records, communication logs, and witness statements that prove you've been systematically lying to me while planning to abandon our marriage." David looked up at me with an expression of complete devastation. "You hired someone to spy on me?" "I hired someone to find out the truth after I discovered the Las Vegas hotel receipt in your jacket pocket. The receipt from the same weekend you claimed to be in Portland attending a software conference that your company has no record of you attending." I sat down in the chair across from him, close enough to see the tears forming in his eyes, but far enough away to maintain my emotional distance. "David, I gave you multiple opportunities to tell me the truth. I asked you directly if there was anything about your business trips that I should know about. You looked me in the eye and lied with such confidence that I almost believed I was being paranoid. Sarah, please. I know how this looks, but I love you. I've always loved you. Jennifer was just a mistake that got out of control." "A mistake that got out of control?" I repeated, opening Elena's report to the section that documented David's relationship timeline. "David, you've been planning to marry Jennifer Walsh for over a year. You've been stealing money from our marriage to fund a life with her. You've been using your employer's resources to support your relationship while lying to everyone about your intentions." I showed him the photographs Elena had taken of his meeting with the divorce attorney, his consultation with the financial advisor, his shopping trip for engagement announcements. "This isn't a mistake that got out of control. This is systematic fraud committed against your wife, your employer, and everyone who trusted you." David stared at the images, his face cycling through shock, denial, and finally acceptance as he realized the scope of what had been documented. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected for 6 weeks. I've known for certain for 3 weeks. I've been preparing for this conversation for 2 weeks. Preparing how?" I handed him the divorce papers Marcus had prepared. Watching his face as he read the preliminary asset division that would give me significantly more than half of our marital property as compensation for his fraudulent behavior. I've been protecting myself from your deception while gathering evidence that will ensure you're held accountable for what you've done." David's hands shook as he flipped through the legal documents. "Sarah, we can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can rebuild trust. I'll end things with Jennifer immediately. I'll do whatever it takes to save our marriage." "David, your relationship with Jennifer ended this morning when she discovered that you'd lost your job and were facing potential criminal charges. Elena has surveillance footage of your conversation at the coffee shop where she apparently made it clear that she wasn't interested in supporting an unemployed man with legal problems." The truth hit David like a physical blow. He doubled over, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as he processed the complete destruction of both his professional and personal future. "She left me?" "She left you the moment your financial situation became uncertain. Jennifer Walsh was never interested in David Martinez, the person. She was interested in David Martinez, the successful software executive who could afford to fund an expensive lifestyle in Las Vegas." I watched David process this information, seeing him realize that his betrayal of our marriage had been rewarded with abandonment by the woman he'd betrayed me for. "How did she find out about my job?" "Companies conduct background checks, David. When TechFlow Solutions fired you for fraud and theft, that information became part of your employment record. Jennifer's reaction to your termination tells you everything you need to know about her feelings for you." David looked up at me with desperate eyes. "What happens now?" "Now you sign the divorce papers and accept responsibility for destroying our marriage through systematic deception and financial fraud. You'll also need to find a criminal defense attorney, because TechFlow Solutions is pressing charges for the money you stole and the proprietary information you may have shared with competitors." "Sarah, please. I know I made mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt you. I was just confused about what I wanted. I thought I could figure things out without anyone getting hurt." "David, you weren't confused. You were calculating. You planned every aspect of your betrayal, while maintaining the appearance of a loving husband. You stole from our marriage to fund another relationship. You used your employer's resources to support your deception. You even took out a life insurance policy with Jennifer as the beneficiary, while keeping me as the beneficiary on our joint policy." I stood up, feeling stronger and more confident than I had in months. "You didn't make mistakes, David. You made choices. You chose to lie to me every day for 2 years. You chose to steal money from our shared finances. You chose to plan a future with another woman while pretending to plan a future with me." David remained seated on the stairs, his head in his hands as I continued. "The man I married would never have done what you've done. Either he never existed, or you changed into someone I don't recognize. Either way, our marriage is over." "Where will you go?" David asked quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my house too, and according to Arizona law, I have every right to remain here during divorce proceedings. You're the one who was planning to relocate to Las Vegas, so you're the one who needs to find somewhere else to live." I walked to the front door and opened it, revealing Marcus Thompson standing on our porch with a briefcase and a calm, professional expression. "David, this is Marcus Thompson, my divorce attorney. He's here to witness your signature on the divorce papers and to serve you with additional legal documents related to the asset division and financial fraud claims." David looked from Marcus to me, his face showing complete defeat. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've protected myself from someone who spent 2 years planning to destroy my life while pretending to love me. I've done what I had to do to survive your betrayal." Marcus entered our living room with the efficiency of someone who'd handled many similar situations. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and removed several folders of legal documents. "Mr. Martinez, I represent your wife in these divorce proceedings. I need to inform you that these papers include claims for financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress based on your systematic deception during your marriage." David's eyes widened as he realized the full scope of the legal consequences he was facing. "Can she do this?" In Arizona, spouses have legal obligations to each other regarding financial honesty and disclosure. Your concealment of assets, your theft of marital funds, and your fraudulent misrepresentation of your intentions constitute serious violations of those obligations. Yes, she can do this, and based on the evidence we've gathered, she's likely to prevail. Marcus opened the first folder and handed David a pen. You can sign these documents voluntarily, or we can serve them formally and proceed through contested litigation. I'd recommend voluntary compliance, as it will be less expensive and less public than the alternative. David looked at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers. If I sign these, what happens to me? You'll be legally divorced within 90 days, assuming you don't contest the asset division or the fraud claims. You'll be responsible for your own legal defense against the criminal charges TechFlow Solutions is pursuing. And you'll need to find employment in an industry where word travels fast about people who've been terminated for fraud. I sat down across from David one final time. David, you spent 2 years planning to leave me in the worst possible financial and emotional position. You calculated exactly how to maximize your advantage while minimizing mine. You even planned to claim that I was the obstacle to your career advancement. David's shoulders sagged as he realized I knew about even his most carefully hidden strategies. How do you know about that? Elena documented your conversations with Jennifer about your divorce strategy. We have recordings of you discussing how to present yourself as the victim of an unreasonable wife who is preventing your professional success. I leaned forward, making sure David could see the determination in my eyes. But you made a crucial mistake. You assumed I would remain the naive, trusting wife who never questioned your stories or challenged your authority. You underestimated my intelligence, my strength, and my capacity to protect myself from your deception. David picked up the pen with trembling hands. I never meant for it to happen this way. You meant for it to happen exactly this way, except you planned to control the timing and the narrative. You were going to blindside me with divorce papers after you'd secured your new job and moved to Las Vegas. You were going to present yourself as someone whose marriage had failed through no fault of your own. I watched David's face as he realized the complete reversal of his carefully planned strategy. Instead, you're signing divorce papers as an unemployed man facing criminal charges, abandoned by the woman you betrayed me for, with no control over the legal proceedings or the financial consequences. David signed the first document, his signature shaky but legible. What happens to us now? There is no us, David. There hasn't been an us for 2 years. I just didn't know it. You made that choice when you decided to invest your emotional energy, your financial resources, and your future plans in someone else while lying to me about your intentions. Marcus collected the signed documents and handed David copies of everything, along with business cards for criminal defense attorneys he recommended. Mr. Martinez, you'll need legal representation for the criminal charges, and I'd suggest you find counsel quickly. The financial fraud allegations are serious, and your former employer appears to have substantial evidence supporting their claims. After Marcus left, David and I sat in our living room in silence for several minutes. The house felt different now, emptier somehow, as if the truth had displaced something that had been filling the space between us for years. I really did love you, Sarah, David said finally. No, you didn't. You loved the security and stability that our marriage provided while you planned your exit strategy. You loved having a wife who trusted you completely, while you built a relationship with someone else. You loved the financial benefits of marriage while you stole from our shared resources. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. Love doesn't involve systematic deception. Love doesn't involve stealing from your partner to fund a relationship with someone else. Love doesn't involve planning to abandon someone while pretending to build a future with them. David looked around our living room, taking in the wedding photos, the vacation souvenirs, the artwork I'd designed, and he'd helped hang. What happens to all of this? The house will be sold and the proceeds divided according to the court's determination of fair compensation for your fraudulent behavior. Most of our shared possessions will be sold or divided. The life we built together will be dismantled because you chose to destroy it. I walked toward the stairs, ready to spend my first evening as a soon-to-be divorced woman in the bedroom I'd shared with a stranger for 2 years. David, you have until Sunday evening to pack your personal belongings and find somewhere else to live. After that, any remaining possessions will be considered abandoned property. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem anymore. You spent 2 years planning a future that didn't include me. Now you get to live in that future, except it's not the future you planned because you lost your job, and Jennifer abandoned you. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at David one final time. You could have been honest with me. You could have told me you were unhappy, that you'd met someone else, that you wanted to end our marriage. I would have been devastated, but I would have respected your honesty and worked with you to end things fairly. David's voice was barely audible. I was afraid you'd try to stop me. I would have tried to fight for our marriage, yes. But when I realized you were truly committed to someone else, I would have let you go. I would have worked with you to divide our assets fairly and end our marriage with dignity. I started up the stairs, then stopped. Instead, you chose deception, theft, and systematic betrayal. You chose to destroy our marriage while pretending to preserve it. You chose to steal from me while planning to abandon me. Those were your choices, David. Now you get to live with the consequences. That night, I lay in our bed alone for the first time in 8 years, listening to David moving around downstairs as he apparently tried to figure out what to do next. I felt many things: sadness, anger, relief, uncertainty about the future, but not regret. I'd protected myself from someone who'd spent 2 years planning to destroy my life. I'd held him accountable for his betrayal. I'd refused to remain the victim of his deception. Saturday morning, I woke up to find David's wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to a handwritten note. Sarah, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll be able to remember the good times we had together. I'm sorry for everything I put you through. I'm sorry for lying to you, for stealing from you, for planning to leave you. I'm sorry for destroying something beautiful, because I was too selfish and cowardly to be honest about what I wanted. The note continued. I'll be staying at a hotel until I can find an apartment. I'll have all my belongings out of the house by Sunday evening. Please keep Jasper. He was always more your cat than mine, and he deserves to stay in his home with someone who actually loves him. I read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the folder with all the other documents from the end of our marriage. David's apology was sincere, but it came 2 years too late. He was sorry because he'd been caught, because his plans had failed, because he was facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sorry for the systematic deception itself, just for the fact that it hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. Sunday evening, I walked through our house after David had collected his belongings and left for the last time. The spaces where his furniture and personal items had been looked strange and empty, but also somehow cleaner. The air felt different, less heavy, as if the weight of his deception had been lifted from our home. I found myself in our former bedroom, looking at the space where David's dresser had been, where his clothes had hung in the closet, where his books and personal items had cluttered the nightstand. The room looked larger without his presence, more like a space that belonged to me rather than to us. On my nightstand, I found one final item David had left behind. A photograph of us from our honeymoon in Maui, both of us smiling and tan, both of us looking genuinely happy and in love. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the couple in that photo, for the naive woman who'd believed her husband when he promised to love and honor her for the rest of their lives. But then I remembered Elena's surveillance photos, images of David and Jennifer planning their wedding while he was still married to me. I remembered the divorce attorney meetings, the financial fraud, the systematic deception that had turned our marriage into an elaborate lie. The couple in the honeymoon photo had been real once, but that reality had been destroyed by David's choices, not by mine. I placed the photograph in the folder with David's apology note and all the other documents from the end of our marriage. Then I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, settling onto the couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. For the first time in 8 years, I was alone in my house, and it felt like freedom. 3 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where David and I had gotten married 8 years earlier, this time to finalize our divorce. Marcus had negotiated a settlement that gave me 65% of our marital assets as compensation for David's fraudulent behavior. The house had sold quickly, and my share of the proceeds would be enough to buy a smaller place in a neighborhood I'd always loved. David looked older, thinner, diminished somehow as he sat at the defendant's table with his attorney. He'd found work as a freelance consultant, earning a fraction of what he'd made at TechFlow Solutions. The criminal charges had been reduced to misdemeanor fraud in exchange for his agreement to pay full restitution to his former employer. Jennifer Walsh had blocked his number and social media accounts, moving on to someone else with better financial prospects. As the judge signed the final decree, I felt something I hadn't expected. pity for the man who'd once been my husband. David had traded 8 years of genuine love and partnership for a fantasy relationship with someone who'd abandoned him the moment his circumstances changed. He destroyed a real marriage for an illusion, and now he was facing the consequences of that choice alone. After the hearing, David approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Sarah, I want you to know that I finally understand what I lost. I know it's too late, but I want you to know that I realize now that what we had was real, and what I thought I wanted with Jennifer was just an escape from my own problems." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing the boy I'd met in college, the man I'd married, the stranger who'd betrayed me, and finally just a human being who'd made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. "David, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I hope you learn to be honest with yourself and with whoever you choose to love next." "What about you? What happens next for you?" I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. "I'm going to build a life that's entirely mine. I'm going to trust my instincts, protect my heart, and never again ignore red flags because I want to believe someone loves me." As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding that first Las Vegas hotel receipt: complete certainty about my future. I was no longer the woman who'd trusted blindly, who'd ignored her instincts, who'd allowed someone else to control her reality through deception and manipulation. I was someone who'd survived betrayal, who'd protected herself from fraud, who'd refused to remain a victim of someone else's lies. I was someone who'd learned that love without honesty isn't love at all, that trust must be earned rather than assumed, and that the most important relationship you can have is an honest one with yourself. 6 months later, I opened my own graphic design studio in a converted warehouse in downtown Phoenix. The space was bright and open, filled with natural light and the energy of creative possibility. I'd hired 2 junior designers and taken on projects that challenged me professionally, while allowing me to build the kind of business I'd always dreamed of owning. Rebecca stopped by on opening day with a bottle of champagne and a smile that reminded me why friendship was so much more valuable than romance built on deception. "Sarah, look at this place. Look at what you've built. You didn't just survive what David did to you, you thrived." As I looked around my studio, filled with artwork that reflected my vision and values, surrounded by people who respected my work and my integrity, I realized that Rebecca was right. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to develop strength I didn't know I had, to trust my instincts, and to build a life that was authentically mine. That evening, I drove to Camelback Mountain and hiked to the viewpoint that overlooked the entire Phoenix Valley. The city spread out below me, millions of lights twinkling in the gathering darkness, each one representing someone's life, someone's dreams, someone's struggles and victories. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 years ago, naive and trusting, believing that love meant never questioning your partner's honesty. I thought about the woman I'd become, stronger and wiser, understanding that real love requires truth, respect, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. As I stood on that mountain, looking out over the city where I'd built a new life from the ashes of my destroyed marriage, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this moment. David's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been educational. It had taught me to value honesty over comfort, truth over illusion, and self-respect over the desperate need to be loved by someone who was incapable of genuine love. I pulled out my phone and sent a text to Elena Rodriguez. "Thank you for helping me discover the truth. It saved my life." Her response came quickly. "You saved your own life, Sarah. I just provided the tools. You had the courage to use them." As I walked back down the mountain trail, I thought about the story I might tell someday about this experience. Not a story about being victimized by a cheating husband, but a story about refusing to remain a victim. A story about trusting your instincts, protecting yourself from deception, and building a life that reflects your values rather than someone else's lies. The woman who'd found that Las Vegas hotel receipt and wondered if she was being paranoid had learned to trust her intuition. The woman who'd hired a private investigator to document her husband's betrayal had learned to take action to protect herself. The woman who'd gathered evidence and held her husband accountable for his deception had learned that justice sometimes requires fighting for it. I was no longer someone who happened to things. I was someone who made things happen, who created her own reality, who refused to accept less than she deserved. David had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover my own strength, my own worth, and my own capacity to build a life that was entirely, authentically mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.